The Soviet translator froze. Blood drained from his face as the words hung in the air. He was terrified to repeat what the American general had just said. Across the room, Marshal Zhukov waited. He was the most ruthless man in the Red Army. This was supposed to be a diplomatic celebration in Bavaria. Instead, Patton had delivered a verbal strike against Stalin's entire regime. The translator feared these words might trigger a massacre. To understand this explosion, we must look at the conquered world. In the occupation zones of Germany, the alliance was rotting. Official photographs showed smiles, but the ground reality was different. It was a cold, bitter friction between American and Soviet officers. They fought over territory, they fought over resources, they fought over the fate of prisoners. Every conversation was a dispute about who truly won the war. George Patton stood at the center of this storm. He never wore a mask. He never pretended to like a man he didn't trust. Patton made his position clear to everyone. He did not like the Soviets. He did not trust the Red Army. He believed the American advance had stopped too soon. This was not a new opinion for him. Since before the war ended, Patton had been shouting the truth. Other commanders played the diplomat. Patton told the world the Red Army was no partner. He saw them as the next enemy. He believed the United States had committed a fatal error. Stopping at the Elbe River was a catastrophe in his eyes. He wanted to push all the way to Moscow. At that moment, the American army was the greatest force on earth. These views were poisonous in Washington in 1945. Eisenhower hated them. Roosevelt and Truman found them dangerous. But Patton spoke anyway. He was incapable of silence. A formal gala was staged in Bavaria in late 1945. It was a calculated display of Allied unity. Senior commanders gathered to toast their shared victory. Everyone on Patton's staff was trembling. His aides begged him to be careful. They reminded him that the Soviets were still allies. They pleaded for professional diplomacy. Patton listened with a cold, distant expression. It was the look of a man who had already chosen his path. He was going to do exactly what he wanted. The Soviet delegation was led by Zhukov. His name alone commanded silence. He was the titan of the Soviet war machine. He saved Moscow and crushed the Germans at Stalingrad. He was the man who finally seized Berlin. His chest was heavy with medals. He was the living symbol of the great patriotic war. Zhukov was an intimidating physical force. He was broad and powerful. He possessed the absolute confidence of a man who had led millions. He had seen more blood than any officer in history. Zhukov knew of Patton. Everyone did. But the Soviet image of the American general was a caricature. It was filtered through a lens of scandal. Intelligence reports focused on the slapping incident and the political fallout. They saw the reprimands, not the genius. In the Red Army, a general who struck a soldier faced a firing squad. Reliability was the only currency. To Zhukov, a survivor of the Great Purge, Patton was simply an undisciplined man. The reception began with stiff, formal rituals. Toasts were raised. Speeches were delivered. The two delegations stood apart, maintaining the cold distance of rivals. Eventually, the two men were brought together. Translators stood ready. A small circle of officers watched the exchange. The American and Soviet records differ on the specifics. That is the nature of history. But the core of the encounter remains undisputed. Zhukov was direct. He was blunt. He made a comment about the Allied drive through France and Germany. It was a deliberate attempt to minimize the achievement. He claimed the Americans moved fast because the Germans were already defeated. The Red Army had broken them before Patton fired a shot. Advancing against a retreating ghost was not war, he suggested. It was a calculated insult. It was aimed directly at the man standing before him. The room went silent. The staff of the Third Army froze. They knew what was coming. Patton locked eyes with Zhukov for a long moment. Then he smiled. It was not a friendly gesture. It was the sharp, predatory grin that his staff feared. He had found his target. Patton spoke through the translator with measured calm. He acknowledged the magnificent fight of the Red Army. He spoke of his respect for the Soviet soldier. Then, he set the trap. Patton offered to compare the record of his Third Army against any Soviet formation. He wanted to go mile by mile. He wanted to count every casualty. He suggested the comparison would be educational for everyone in the room. Then he delivered the final strike. Patton noted that generals who try to diminish the victories of others are usually insecure. They are afraid their own records cannot survive the same scrutiny. He spoke with a terrifying softness. He had never required an ally to shatter an enemy before he arrived. He would not begin accepting that characterization now. The American interpreter felt the blood drain from his face. Zhukov locked eyes with Patton. The room fell into an absolute, suffocating silence. Then Zhukov spat a Russian sentence so vile, it was later described as unprintable. The Soviet delegation shifted in a wave of visible discomfort. The existing tension curdled into something far more predatory. Zhukov struck directly at the Americans' courage. He sneered that boldness was cheap during a comfortable reception. A soldier's true nature was forged only under falling shells. He made his meaning brutally clear. Patton was merely an actor playing at war. He was a man who performed bravery but never truly practiced it. If the Russian expected Patton to recoil, he had misjudged his man entirely. Patton had bled in 2 world wars. He had charged at the head of tank columns through hellfire. He stood tall during artillery barrages to show his men a leader's face. Combat was his oxygen. Being called a coward was not just an insult, it was a grotesque absurdity. To hear it from a Soviet general triggered a cold, lethal shift in Patton. He closed the distance between them. His staff tensed, uncertain whether to intervene. Patton stared into the Russian's eyes with unnatural calm. He offered to prove his courage at any time. He offered any place of Zhukov's choosing. If the Russian had a specific proposal, he should speak it now. Let everyone in the room hear the terms. 30 years of preparation had led to this exact moment. His record required no defense from his own tongue. Then came the words that would echo through history. He told Zhukov his honest observation of the Red Army. Its greatest danger was not the courage of its soldiers. It was the generals who mistook surviving Stalin for understanding the art of war. The ensuing silence was heavy and permanent. This was not a pause of anticipation. It was the realization that something irreversible had happened. Patton knew the weight of his words. He had chosen them like armor-piercing rounds. Zhukov remained motionless. His eyes betrayed a mix of white-hot rage and cold calculation. Perhaps, deep down, there was a flicker of grim respect. Finally, Zhukov turned away. He whispered a command to his staff. The Soviets retreated to the far side of the hall. The 2 groups remained separated for the rest of the night. Later, the official report would call the evening productive. It noted that both sides had engaged in a frank exchange of views. In the sterile language of diplomacy, this was a disaster. Everyone present felt the weight of it. Patton's staff spent the following days in desperate damage control. The Soviets had filed a formal protest through military channels. They were insulted by the American tone. Eisenhower's headquarters was beyond furious. Patton was summoned to explain himself. He approached the meeting with zero enthusiasm. He never had patience for people telling him he was wrong. He stood before Eisenhower's chief of staff. He argued he had represented America with total honesty. He had not started the confrontation. He refused to apologize for meeting a direct insult with a direct response. If American policy required silence while Soviets questioned his courage, then the policy was wrong. He said he would tell the President of the United States exactly that. His defiance only fueled the fire. It accelerated a process that had been moving for months. In the new post-war world, Patton was impossible to control. He was too blunt. He was too honest. He refused to play the diplomatic games the occupation demanded. He spoke too freely about former Nazis. He was vocal about the Soviet threat. He even talked of entering politics back home. To the men in power, his usefulness had expired. The shooting had stopped. Now he was just a problem to be solved. 3 months after that reception, they stripped him of command of the Third Army. 3 months later, he was dead. The accident was strange. It was low speed and unlikely. It was fatal only to him. He died in a land he liberated. He was on a road with no real reason to be there. The circumstances have never satisfied those who look closely. Zhukov outlived him by 29 years. He survived Stalin. He survived 2 purges and the entire Cold War. He died in 1974 as the most decorated officer in Soviet history. Zhukov never mentioned that night in Bavaria. He never spoke of his conversation with Patton in any interview. This is telling. Zhukov remembered everything. He usually stayed silent only about things that still troubled him. To the Soviet military, Patton was the only American general they truly feared. Their secret files were declassified after the Cold War. They described him as genuinely dangerous. He was unpredictable. He was driven by something deeper than a career. He fought because he believed in it. That made him impossible to stop. The Soviet assessment reached one final conclusion. It was lucky for the world that Patton's superiors kept him on a leash. A Patton with total freedom would have been a different problem entirely. Patton would have taken that as a compliment. He viewed most insults as a tribute. In 1945, at a formal reception in Bavaria, a Soviet general called him a coward. Patton simply looked at him. He met the accusation with the same steady smile he had worn all evening. There was a chilling calm in his expression. There was a total absence of doubt. George Patton never required permission to understand his own value. He never allowed another soul to define him. Not his superiors, not his enemies, and certainly not a Soviet general who mistook the act of surviving a dictator for the true meaning of courage.